Hello, I'm Ben, and you're watching The PhD Parent. So cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT, is one of the most widely used and well-researched psychological treatment approaches for anxiety, depressive, and other emotional disorders. In this video, I'm going to outline the key components of a typical CBT treatment package for these types of disorders. At their core, these components are pretty much the same, irrespective of whether the treatment is for a child or an adult. Now, of course, there is more to CBT than I'll describe. I'm just going to go over the key bits. So first of all, the C in CBT. So the C in CBT stands for cognitive, that is, thoughts. The basic premise that underlies the cognitive part of CBT is that while the situations we encounter in our day-to-day lives contribute to how we feel and behave, how we think about these situations also plays a major role. And I'll illustrate with an example. So suppose you have two new mums, Jackie and Jill. They both got a 2-week-old baby, and they've been spending most of their time at home adjusting to parenthood. They each get a message from a friend inviting them and Bub out to the park. Jackie feels anxious and responds to the message with, "I'm busy," that is, she avoids going out. Jill feels excited and responds to the message with, "I'll be there," that is, she takes the opportunity to go out. Now, why are there differences in the emotional and behavioural responses of Jackie and Jill? Now, hint, these differences can't be due to the situation because the situation is the same for Jackie and Jill. Well, the answer is because there are differences in what they're thinking about the situation. So Jackie is thinking to herself, "Bub will start crying and won't stop. I might have trouble breastfeeding while I'm out. I look like a wreck, and my friend will think I'm not coping." Jill is thinking to herself, "It'll be so good to get out of the house. I'm looking forward to seeing my friend. It'll be great to do baby's first play date." Now forget for a moment whether what they are thinking is correct or incorrect. If you're Jackie and you're thinking that baby is going to have a throwdown, will not be able to eat, and that your friend is going to judge you negatively, then it's understandable that you'd feel anxious and that you might stay at home. If you're Jill and you're thinking what a great opportunity to get out of the house, see a friend and introduce your baby to the world, then of course you're going to be feeling upbeat and will jump at the opportunity to go out. So the moral of the story is how we think about the situations we encounter plays a big role in how we feel and behave. That's the key focus of the cognitive part of CBT, involves identifying unhelpful or unrealistic, inaccurate, distorted thoughts. I'll just call them unhelpful thoughts from now on. And providing people with tools to challenge these thoughts and replace them with thoughts that better reflect the objective reality of the world. Now, before getting stuck into the cognitive stuff, there are two important things to touch on. First is the distinction between thoughts and feelings. So as mentioned, the main strategy involved in the cognitive part of CBT is challenging unhelpful thoughts. To do this requires you to be able to identify your thoughts. Now, one of the reasons why this can be difficult is that the language we use when we talk to ourselves hides our thoughts in plain sight. Specifically, we often say things such as, "I feel that," or "it just feels like," or "I don't feel as though," or whatever. And then rather than going on to describe a feeling, we end up describing a thought. So consider the following examples. "I feel that my husband doesn't listen to me." That's not a feeling, it's a thought. The question to ask is, when you have the thought that your husband doesn't listen to you, how do you feel? Maybe upset or disappointed. "It feels like everything is piling up around me." Again, that's not a feeling, it's a thought. When you have the thought that everything is piling up around you, how do you feel? Maybe stressed or anxious. "I don't feel as though I do enough for the kids." Once again, not a feeling, it's a thought. So when you have the thought that you don't do enough for the kids, how do you feel? Maybe guilty or ashamed. So it's important to be aware of the distinction between thoughts and feelings, and to catch yourself when you say that you're feeling a particular way when in fact you're describing a thought. Now on to what CBT is not. So the cognitive part of CBT is not about thinking positively. It's about thinking in a way that best reflects the objective reality of the world. So if you're thinking things are bad, and you're right, the answer is not to start thinking that everything is good. You would just be fooling yourself, and it could lead to negative outcomes. For example, imagine that you have the anxiety-provoking thought, "I'm going to run out of petrol and I'm going to be stuck with 2 screaming kids in the car." Now, if this thought is accurate, you really are going to run out of petrol, then the answer to reducing your anxiety is not to replace this thought with a more positive one such as, "I've got plenty of petrol, we'll make it home easily." That'd be a bad idea. The answer is to go and fill up the car. So, as will be discussed in the following, CBT is about identifying unhelpful thoughts, challenging them, and developing alternative thoughts that, while they may well be more positive, most importantly, are thoughts that more accurately reflect the way the world is. So, the ABCs of CBT. Now remember, the basic premise that underlies the cognitive part of CBT is that our thoughts impact our feelings and behavior. So if you're finding that you tend to feel anxious or depressed a lot, chances are that your thinking will be characterized by unhelpful thoughts. So what do you do about them? First step is to become aware of these unhelpful thoughts, which you can do through an ABC analysis, where ABC stands for A, activating event, B, beliefs, and C, consequences. So you start with the A, the activating event. This could be something internal, for example, a thought or a physical sensation, or it could be something external. For example, your delightful toddler throwing the keys in the bin and the rubbish then being collected, as happened to us. Next, record the C, consequences. This would include how you felt, and you can rate that on a scale of 0 to 100, and how you behaved, that is, what did you do. Now the trickier bit is write down the B's, beliefs. People generally don't have too much trouble identifying what CBT folks call automatic thoughts. That is, these are the thoughts being said by that little voice in your head. But often you'll want or need to dig a little deeper to uncover your more unhelpful thoughts. The way you do this is by asking yourself questions such as, what do I reckon is bad about X? What would be the worst thing if X happened? What does it say about me that X, whatever X might be? Basically, what you're trying to do is uncover the thought or thoughts that if you had these thoughts, it would explain why you were feeling whatever it is you were feeling. So best to illustrate with an example, and I'll stick with Jackie and her anxiety about going out with Bug for the first time. Now, if you take a look at the B column, consider the first thought, baby might start crying intensely. Now, this thought is probably not enough to explain why Jackie is feeling anxious. To illustrate, suppose she were to also think, but that's no big deal, I can handle that. Jackie is feeling highly anxious, so she's probably not thinking this second bit. Thus, you need to dig deeper. And you could do that by asking, what would be bad about it? And maybe the answer is, I won't be able to stop her crying. Again, this is not enough to explain why Jackie is feeling anxious. Suppose she were to think, that'll be annoying, but it's not the end of the world. Again, because Jackie is feeling highly anxious, she's probably not thinking this. So you need to keep digging. And you could do that by asking, what would be the worst thing about that? That is, not being able to stop your baby crying. Now maybe Jackie is thinking, my friend will think I can't take care of my baby. Once more, this is not enough to explain why Jackie is feeling anxious, because if she were also to think, but it doesn't matter what my friend thinks, then she probably wouldn't be so anxious. So there must be more to it. And you could get at that by asking, and that would be bad because, suppose Jackie says, well, she'll think I'm a bad mum. So now we're getting somewhere. But again, if she were to think, but what my friend thinks doesn't matter, then as before, she probably wouldn't be particularly anxious. One more time, dig deeper by asking, and what would that be like for you? And here Jackie says, well, that'd be horrible. I'd hate for her to think that. Now, in principle, you could keep going, but that will do as we've arrived at a point where we've identified that Jackie is thinking that something horrible could happen, which she would hate. And that's not a bad explanation of why she's feeling anxious. So this example illustrates the process of how you can uncover unhelpful beliefs that drive feelings and behavior. In this case, it's a fear of being judged negatively by others and evaluating such judgment to be horrible. And if you think a horrible thing could happen, then fair enough, you feel anxious and try to avoid it happening. Having uncovered unhelpful beliefs, the next step is to examine the validity of those beliefs, which I'll cover in the next section. The ABCs, Ds, and Es of CBT. So people use different analogies for this next bit, but a common one is to imagine that you're putting a thought on trial. You then act as defense and prosecution. So what is the evidence that the thought is true, and what is the evidence that it's false? Then you act as the judge and deliver a verdict. Is the thought true or false? So the first part, where you're coming up with the evidence for and against the thought, is the D, disputation. The second part, where you're the judge, looking at all the evidence for and against the thought and delivering a verdict, is the E, evaluation. So going back to the previous example, in principle, you could put any of the thoughts on trial, but I'm going to go with, I won't be able to stop my baby crying. So the process might look something like this. Start by rating how true you reckon the thought is. In this example, let's say it's 90% true. Then go on to consider the evidence for and against the thought, the D, the disputation. And finally, what you now think when taking this evidence into consideration. E, evaluation. So perhaps the evidence for is there have been a couple of times where it's been very difficult to get her to stop crying. And maybe there could be other evidence, but let's consider evidence against. I am almost always able to stop her crying. Even when it's hard, she eventually stops crying. I've worked out a few different ways to soothe her when she's upset, and she hasn't really been getting that upset lately. So then taking this evidence into consideration, the thought you might end up with is, while it's possible that I won't be able to stop my baby crying, she hasn't been getting as upset lately. I've pretty much always been able to soothe her, and I'm getting to know her better, which is helping me to calm her when she's upset. And once you've been through this process, it can be good to go back and have a think about how you would feel if you had the new thought, which you've just come up with, having reflected upon the evidence for and against the original thought. For example, if I had the new thought now, I might only feel 2 out of 10 anxious. And it can also be worthwhile to consider how true you think the original thought was in light of your reflection on the evidence. For example, now it's only 10% true as opposed to 90% true to begin with. So that's a crash course in the cognitive path of CBT. There are plenty of great resources online if you're interested in following up. I reckon some of the best are published by the Centre for Clinical Interventions, which you can find at this website here. You just need to check out their self-help resources page. So now onto the B in CBT. So the B in CBT stands for behavior. I'll first discuss behavior in the context of anxiety disorders and then in the context of depressive disorders. So in terms of anxiety, the behavior of most relevance is avoidance. People tend to avoid situations that evoke anxiety. Now, avoidance is a great way to manage anxiety in the short term. Using the example of Jackie, avoiding going out is a very effective, short-term way for her to relieve her anxiety. But in the long term, avoidance is not helpful. At best, avoidance will lead to the maintenance of anxiety, but perhaps more likely is that it will result in anxiety getting worse. The reason for this is that avoidance robs you of the opportunity to learn that a feared outcome is either unlikely to happen, not as bad as you are thinking, or that you are capable of coping with the outcome if it did occur. So now on to addressing behavioral avoidance through graded exposure. So a key behavioral part of CBT for anxiety involves what we call graded exposure. Put simply, graded exposure involves you confronting situations that make you feel anxious by slowly working your way up from situations that elicit low levels of anxiety to situations that elicit high levels of anxiety. Starting with the highly anxiety-provoking situations can sometimes be counterproductive. So in the following, I'll walk you through an example of graded exposure. We'll again stick with Jackie and her anxiety about going out with baby. So step 1, set a goal. First, Jackie needs to work out a goal. This goal should be concrete and realistic. In the context of graded exposure, it would be a situation that would be highly anxiety-provoking. That is, you have a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 is no anxiety whatsoever, and 10 is extremely crappy pants anxious. Not feeling anxious when out with baby would not be a good goal. This one falls over at the first hurdle in that it's not concrete. That is, what is meant by out with my baby. So maybe something like go to the local shopping centre just with baby for 1 hour would be a good goal. It's concrete, it's realistic, and for Jackie, it would be highly anxiety-provoking. Let's say 10 out of 10. So step 2, break it down. The second thing Jackie needs to do is come up with a bunch of situations, all of which are related to a goal, but which are less anxiety-provoking than the goal. What she needs to end up with are a few situations that elicit mild anxiety, 1 to 3 level of anxiety, a few that elicit moderate anxiety, 4 to 6 level of anxiety, and a few that elicit high anxiety, 7+ level of anxiety. Some helpful ways to break a goal into smaller steps is by changing, for example, who's going to be involved in the situation, for example, doing it alone or with a trusted person, how many people are going to be involved, where the situation takes place, for example, familiar versus unfamiliar location, and how long you're in the situation for. Incidentally, exposure doesn't have to occur in real life. That is, imaginal exposure, as the label suggests, you imagine a particular situation, can be very useful, especially if the situation you're anxious about is not one that readily lends itself to real-life exposure. In step 3, create your ladder. In this step, Jackie needs to give an anxiety rating to each of the situations generated in the previous step, and then put these in order from least to most anxiety-provoking. In the following table, I created a graded exposure ladder for Jackie. Ideally, there'll be enough situations so that there are no big jumps in the ladder. Remember, in this example, the fear was that the baby will cry uncontrollably and that others will judge Jackie negatively because of this. So the exposure tasks are a mix of situations that involve getting out of the house with versus without a support person. In this case, Jackie's husband, Jim. And these are mixed with situations where the crying could start, where others could versus could not see this, with the amount of time being more versus less. So at the top, you've got go to the local shopping centre just with baby for 1 hour. Then go to the park just with baby for 30 minutes when it's busy. And then go to the park just with baby for 30 minutes when no one else is around, and so on. Step 4 is do it. So you start at the first exposure task and gradually work your way up. So here are some tips for graded exposure. So you've got to stay in the situation. One of the most important parts of graded exposure is to ensure that you or your child remains in whatever the situation is until you or they feel relatively comfortable, at least for those exposures where no time limit is imposed. There are no rules about this, but I've seen people suggest that it's important to stay in the situation until anxiety has dropped to at least half of what it was to begin with, and others suggest staying in the situation until anxiety falls to a 3 or lower. Repetition is important. Each exposure task should be repeated, ideally until exposure to the situation can occur without it eliciting much anxiety at all. And this may take a few goes. It can be best to try and complete one and only one exposure activity at a time. And if you're helping your child complete graded exposure, do your best to remain calm. It can be upsetting and or frustrating when your child is feeling anxious, but it's ultimately going to be for the best. And the more you can remain calm, the easier it'll be to move up the ladder. And finally, reward yourself or your child for each graded exposure exercise you or they complete. So now on to behavioral activation and depression. One of the hallmarks of depression is behavioral inactivity or withdrawal. This might arise because of feelings of tiredness, low motivation, a loss of pleasure, or difficulties with decision making. The behavioural inactivity or withdrawal can contribute to depression, forming a vicious cycle as shown here. For example, a person may be feeling depressed and find that due to inactivity, things start piling up around the home, which leads them to think that they're incapable or a failure, which in turn contributes to depression. So a key behavioural part of CBT for depression is behavioural activation. That is, getting out there and doing stuff. There are a few reasons why behavioural activation is helpful. First, it can be a distraction from depressive thoughts. Second, depression may worsen feelings of tiredness and fatigue. While people may want to rest up, this can lead to more intense feelings of tiredness and fatigue. Doing the opposite, that is being behaviourally active, can combat depression-related feelings of tiredness and fatigue. And finally, while you can, in principle, feel good about yourself in the absence of action, many people will judge themselves on their actions or lack thereof. So becoming more behaviourally active gives you a solid base upon which you can think more positively about yourself. In terms of behavioural activation for depression, it's common to lump behaviours into two categories: stuff that's fun and stuff that gives you a sense of achievement. The reason for this is that often when people are depressed, they've stopped doing fun, pleasurable, enjoyable things, and so it's good to start doing these kinds of activities. Also, when people are depressed, they experience feelings of worthlessness or a lack of purpose, hence doing activities that give you a sense of achievement. Now, it's not easy to get started with behavioural activation, so it's usually suggested that you start with something simple and start small, and work your way up from there. And in my experience, nothing is too small. As long as it's more than what you've been doing, that's a start. Another difficulty people often have is coming up with activities to do. The following link provides access to a self-help workbook with 365 activities that people can try. Now, one final part of CBT, relaxation. So relaxation is a skill that is commonly practiced in CBT. There are several different relaxation approaches that CBT therapists might get you to use. One of the most common and most straightforward is breathing retraining. It involves not much more than breathe in for 4 seconds through your nose, hold for 2 seconds, and then breathe out for 6 seconds through your mouth. You want to be breathing into your stomach rather than your chest. So give this a crack for 10 minutes each morning or whatever. Of course, there are other more sophisticated relaxation techniques. For example, progressive muscle relaxation, which involves tensing different muscles in your body for about 10 seconds and then slowly releasing, starting with your feet and moving your way up. So for the moment, that's the end of my crash course in CBT. If you've got any questions, then feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, happy parenting.